There's a moment in certain conversations where the room changes, not because someone raised their voice, but because someone said something as if it were obvious. Mike Martz did that here, and most people listening didn't catch it. This wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't a coaching resume tour, and it definitely wasn't a hot take. What slipped through was a way of seeing Cleveland that almost no one talks about anymore. Not as a broken franchise, not as a quarterback graveyard, but as an unfinished structure, one that's been interrupted at the same pressure point over and over again when someone who's built offenses, developed quarterbacks, and survived power struggles across eras talks casually about control, development, and direction. They're not answering the question that was asked. They're answering the one underneath it. Listen closely and you start to hear a pattern. Not about playbooks, not about scheme, but about what organizations quietly allow and what they refuse to let settle. Cleveland keeps circling the same decisions, and each time something subtle changes behind the scenes. Who holds authority? Who absorbs blame? Who actually gets time? Martz didn't frame this as a gamble. He framed it as a test of patience, of alignment, of whether development is real or just something teams say while cycling through answers. And once you notice that framing, it becomes harder to look at the Browns or their next quarterback the same way again. Because this wasn't about the job. It was about why the job keeps meaning something different to different people. A reason comments like this don't land immediately. They aren't designed to. Mike Martz didn't step into that conversation trying to relitigate a firing or rehabilitate a reputation. He spoke the way people do when they've already sorted the hierarchy in their own mind, when they're less interested in the surface event than in why it keeps repeating.
There are not a lot of them around. I think the older guy like Jim who's done it, has learned from it. He's got terrific leadership. His players play for him at a high level. You watch his guys play, the details are coached. So you got the leadership and the high football acumen. And obviously on that side of the ball, you can't be a good coach on that side and not know what a good quarterback is. So, my vote would be for him, to be honest with you. I think he'd make a good head coach there.
Because if you strip away the names, the Browns situation doesn't look chaotic. It looks patterned. Coaches come through Cleveland and leave with roughly the same resume. Competent, respected, quietly defended by other coaches, and eventually framed as not the right fit. That framing matters. It shifts responsibility without ever naming where authority actually lives. Martz doesn't challenge that directly. He doesn't need to. Instead, he talks about leadership and football acumen as if they're scarce resources, not buzzwords. Not traits you can crowdsource from analytics, departments, or borrow from the latest trend. Scarce, finite, and often misunderstood by the people doing the hiring. That's where the subtext sits. Because when someone with decades in NFL buildings starts questioning whether decision makers understand what a head coach actually does, that's not a critique of candidates. It's a critique of the structure selecting them. Cleveland isn't unusual for wanting change. What's unusual is where the pressure for change keeps concentrating. Quarterback, offensive control, personnel authority. Over time, those three areas collapse into one fault line. When they're misaligned, the organization doesn't stall, it spins. And spinning creates motion that feels like progress without producing stability. Martz has seen this before. Not just in Cleveland, across eras where coaches were evaluated on outcomes they didn't fully own, while being denied the leverage required to shape them. That's why his praise of Kevin Stefanski is so measured. He talks about competitiveness, toughness, preparation, things that show up when leadership is working within constraints. He also openly wonders how much control Stefanski actually had, and leaves that thought unfinished. That unfinished sentence matters because in NFL buildings, control isn't binary. It's negotiated. And when that negotiation never resolves, you get a revolving door of philosophies layered on top of each other, each one partially implemented, none fully trusted. Martz doesn't say Cleveland failed Stefanski. He implies something quieter. Cleveland never decided what it wanted him to be. And that indecision creates downstream effects. When teams interview coaches across extreme age ranges, veterans who've done it before, and first-timers who've never called plays, it signals uncertainty about what problem they're actually trying to solve. Experience versus innovation isn't the real question. Authority versus alignment is. Martz's criteria are tellingly old-fashioned. Leadership, accountability, deep understanding of the game on both sides of the ball. Not charisma, not relatability, not system fluency alone. Why? Because systems travel easily. Authority doesn't. This is where the Browns' job starts to look less like a reset and more like a mirror, a reflection of whether the organization is ready to let one vision settle long, enough to be tested honestly, or whether it will keep protecting itself by fragmenting. Responsibility. Martz single quotes S reaction to other league situations reinforces this. When he mentions Buffalo, he doesn't focus on wins or losses. He talks about power struggles, friction, personnel decisions divorced from quarterback development. Again, same fault line. Quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. They fail inside ecosystems that don't agree on what they're supposed to become. So, when Martz casually says he'd take the Cleveland job in a heartbeat, it's not bravado. It's a diagnostic statement. He's identifying an organization that's close enough to functional to be tempting and misaligned, enough to be dangerous that combination attracts a certain type of coach. One who believes problems aren't talent-based, but permission-based, and that belief carries risk, because solving issues in Cleveland doesn't require brilliance. It requires access. The ability to decide, to develop, and to be allowed to stay long enough for those decisions to compound. Most coaches never get all three. That's why this moment matters now. Not because of who Cleveland hires next, but because of whether this cycle finally slows enough to reveal who's actually steering. And once you see that, the quarterback conversation stops being the starting point. It becomes the consequence. There's a quiet difference between having authority and being trusted with it. NFL organizations blur that line all the time. On paper, head coaches are empowered. In practice, they operate inside invisible boundaries, negotiated lines drawn by ownership, front offices, and long-term institutional habits. When those lines shift without being named, leadership becomes performative rather than directive. This is the environment Martz keeps circling without pointing it directly. He talks about leadership as if it's an organizing force, not a personality trait. Direction, accountability, facilitation, these aren't motivational concepts, they're structural ones. They describe how information flows, how decisions settle, and how conflict gets resolved before it reaches the field. Most teams say they want that. Fewer actually tolerate it because real leadership compresses ambiguity. It removes excuses, and it exposes where power truly lives. That's uncomfortable for organizations built on distributed blame. Cleveland's history suggests a pattern. When results disappoint, authority fragments. Responsibility spreads sideways instead of upward. The coach absorbs outcomes without fully owning inputs. Martz doesn't accuse anyone of this. He simply describes what a functioning environment requires and lets the contrast speak. When he separates leadership from football acumen, he's outlining a filter, one that eliminates most candidates immediately. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they've never been asked to integrate vision with execution across both sides of the ball. That integration matters more than age, more than trends. Veteran coaches bring scar tissue. Young coaches bring fluency, but neither survives long in a building that hasn't agreed on who decides what when it matters. Notice how often Martz returns to quarterbacks without naming plays. Development, teaching, relationship, time, those words surface when organizations outsource. Patience while demanding results. Quarterbacks become proxies for larger trust failures they're drafted into. Systems that expect immediate return, coached by staffs with partial authority and evaluated by executives already hedging their next decision. When it breaks, the narrative simplifies. The player wasn't good enough, but Martz reframes it subtly. There are more capable quarterbacks than there are environments willing to develop them. That statement doesn't flatter coaches or executives. It indicts process, and process is where leadership either consolidates or collapses. When Martz references coaches who can watch a game and identify a coordinator's background instantly, he's pointing to something deeper than film study. He's describing organizational fingerprints, tendencies that show up under pressure. Who adjusts? Who freezes? Who protects the system instead of the player? Cleveland's challenge isn't identifying talent. It's deciding who gets to shape it. And that decision can't be made halfway. Half measures create environments where no one fails decisively and no one succeeds. SUSTAINABL. Why? This is why Martz's admiration for certain coaches feels almost clinical. He's not praising innovation. He's praising coherence. The rare alignment where philosophy, authority, and patience intersect. Those environments don't produce headlines. They produce continuity, and continuity is the one thing Cleveland keeps interrupting, not always intentionally. Often quietly. Each coaching change resets trust clocks. Each quarterback debate reframes development timelines. Each front office adjustment redraws authority lines without announcing them. From the outside, it looks like motion. From the inside, it feels like hesitation. Inside, it feels like hesitation. Leadership in the NFL isn't proven by speeches or schemes. It's proven by what an organization is willing to let remain unfinished without panicking. Martz understands that. He's lived through eras where quarterbacks were molded over seasons, not cycles. Where coaches were allowed to be wrong before being right. Cleveland hasn't decided whether it believes in that model, and until it does, every hire carries the same unspoken question: are you here to lead or to absorb the fallout? Pause. That question hangs over the next phase because now the conversation narrows. Not to a coach, but to a quarterback whose name already carries more meaning than certainty. This is where the conversation tightens, because once leadership and authority are unsettled, quarterback discussions stop being about traits and start being about tolerance. Shedeur Sanders enters this space already carrying more than tape. His name signals confidence, expectations, visibility. That matters. Not because it guarantees success, but because it changes how quickly patience evaporates. Organizations like to say they'll treat every quarterback the same. They never do. Martz doesn't commit to Sanders. He does something more revealing. He pauses. He says he'd need to see him closer. That hesitation isn't doubt, it's respect for complexity. An acknowledgement that quarterbacks don't arrive finished. They arrive context-dependent, and that's the risk, because Cleveland isn't deciding whether Sanders can play. They're deciding whether they can hold still while someone learns. Shedeur's profile amplifies everything Cleveland struggles with. Visibility accelerates judgment. Confidence invites resistance. Early mistakes become narratives instead of lessons. In stable environments, that pressure can be absorbed. In fractured ones, it gets redirected, often toward the player. Martz's philosophy cuts against modern impatience. He talks about toughness, accuracy, decisiveness, but always in relation to coaching, teaching, development, time spent together. He's describing a process that can't be rushed without distorting outcomes. Sanders doesn't need saving. He needs clarity about who teaches him, who protects him, who decides when growth outweighs results. Here's where the pattern sharpens. Highly visible quarterbacks, placed into ambiguous authority structures, don't fail quietly. They fracture narratives. Fans split. Media polarizes. Internally, factions form, each defending a different explanation for why progress isn't linear. The quarterback becomes the loudest variable in a system that hasn't stabilized its quiet ones. Martz's career offers a counterexample. Quarterbacks he references weren't crowned early. They were committed to. That commitment created margin for error. It also created accountability, real accountability, because everyone knew where decisions lived. Shedeur's future hinges less on arm talent and more on whether Cleveland is prepared to consolidate responsibility around him rather than spread it. And consolidation requires something Cleveland has historically struggled to grant: trust without immediate proof. This isn't about whether Sanders is the guy. It's about whether the organization is ready to let any guy become one. There's also the question of control. Sanders has grown inside environments where identity was clear. Expectations were explicit. The offense belonged to someone. That continuity shapes how quarterbacks process adversity. Drop him into a building, still negotiating its power structure, and every rep carries extra weight. Not just football weight, political weight. Who's this for? Who approved this? Who's accountable if it stalls? Those questions don't show up on tape. They show up in timing routes thrown a half beat late, in hesitation on third down, in confidence that flickers instead of compounds. Martz understands that quarterbacks reflect their surroundings faster than they transform them. That's the quiet warning embedded in his confidence. When he says the quarterback problem isn't that hard, he's not minimizing the position. He's indicting the environment. He's saying the difficulty is organizational, not evaluative. If Cleveland drafts Sanders, the risk isn't failure. The risk is ambiguity. Ambiguity about voice, about patience, about whether development is real or conditional. And ambiguity has a way of exposing itself right when expectations peak. This is why Martz's comments linger. They aren't about Cleveland's past. They're about whether the franchise is ready for a quarterback who will test its alignment simply by existing. Sanders doesn't arrive quietly. And Cleveland hasn't learned how to grow loudly without flinching. That tension doesn't resolve on draft night. It resolves or unravels over months of small, Decisions no one tweets about, and that's where the real risk lives. There are moments when organizations think they're choosing a person, a coach, a quarterback, a direction, but really, they're choosing a behavior. Cleveland's next decision won't just reveal who they believe in. It will reveal what they're willing to sit with when things aren't clean yet, because patience isn't passive. It's active restraint. It's deciding not to intervene when growth looks like discomfort. Mike Martz didn't offer a solution. He offered a mirror, and in that reflection is a question Cleveland keeps postponing. Do we want control? Or do we want coherence? Those two aren't the same. Coherence means fewer voices, clearer authority, and accountability that doesn't shift with the wind. It means letting development take its natural shape, even when the outside noise demands acceleration. That choice doesn't generate headlines. It generates stability. If Cleveland gets this right, the quarterback conversation changes quietly. Progress won't be dramatic. It will be cumulative. Confidence will build in ways that don't need defending. If they don't, the cycle will repeat, with a new face carrying an old... Wait. So this moment isn't about Mike Martz, and it isn't about Shedeur Sanders. It's about whether Cleveland is finally ready to stop mistaking movement for progress, because the most revealing decisions aren't the ones that announce themselves. They're the ones that determine what an organization allows to remain unfinished without panicking, and that's the decision no draft pick can make for them.